So I want to welcome you to episode 70 of the Everyday Spirituality podcast. My guest today is Jason Smith, who's the author of a new book that we'll be talking about. Jason is a graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute in Boston and the Pacifica Graduate Institute. He has over 20 years of clinical experience in private practice. He's also a trainer and faculty member of the C.G. Jung Institute of New England. He has a podcast that I've certainly come to appreciate. It's called Digital Jung, The Symbolic Life in a Technological Age. And it's a wonderful and succinct introduction to his book, Religious But Not Religious, Living a Symbolic Life. So yes, you heard that right. It's religious but not religious as opposed to spiritual but not religious. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate being invited to a conversation.
Yeah. Anything to add to your bio? Did I cover it sufficiently?
You covered it. Those are the core pieces. Yeah, I'm a Jungian analyst in private practice, and a lot of my work centers around that, Jung and religion.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, so tell us just a little bit about this book, why you wrote it, how it came to be. What's the story behind the book? Having written one myself recently, I know there's always a story behind the actual writing and your motivation for it.
Yeah, the book is really the roots of it. Well, I don't know how far back they go, but it really comes out of my own trying to work out my relationship with these different areas, these different domains of life, religion on the one hand, psychology on the other hand, and their relationship with each other. When I was going through my training and going through my own analysis, these larger questions, right? These kind of ultimate questions were the centerpiece. And really, when I began to look at it, I recognized that they've always been present. They've been things as far back as I can remember without really any outlet for them. And while I was going through analysis, I was also kind of dipping my toes into church life and starting to explore the experience of being in a faith tradition. And what I found was analysis was really great for addressing some of the questions that I had, but it couldn't do all of it. And I found that my church experience was really good at addressing some of the questions and some of the experiences, but there was something it wasn't addressing. And so this question of the relationship between these two areas and how they interacted and how they might work together, complement each other, became a really sort of pressing matter. And I began to think more about it. And then I would be doing talks for different audiences on the subject, on the matter that would become the book. And what I found was the responses that I got let me know that it wasn't just my question. It wasn't just a question that I had, that it was a question that had sort of general interest, general applicability. So I knew then that this wasn't just me, this was something that could be a book because it could speak to a wider audience. And I was encouraged by that to kind of dive into that long sort of writing process.
Mm-hmm. And so before we get into the book itself, let's talk a little bit about Carl Jung. I mean, many people who'll be listening to this podcast might know a little bit about Jung, who he is. Maybe we could just kind of lay the foundation, because it's a big part of what you've written about, is his work in the area of both psychology and religion.
Right. So Jung, Carl Jung's a contemporary of Sigmund Freud, and he's part of that early development of psychoanalysis, and he's a contemporary and colleague of Freud's, but they begin to develop different ideas about the psyche, about psychology, and their paths diverge. And really the core way to understand Jung's view of the psyche is that it is a prospective view of the psyche. It's looking to the future. It's looking to what wants to grow and what wants to develop. And that's a contrast really to Freud, that tends to look more to the past, what caused disturbances and difficulties. So for Jung, the disturbances and the difficulties are a barrier to continued growth, and potentially a key to understanding what's trying to come into existence. And that kind of points to this sort of other layer of Jung, which is his psyche, his view of the psyche is not just personal, it's transpersonal. It's what he calls archetypal. And what that really means is that he's looking at human universals, universal experiences of what it means to be a human being. And our understanding of those universals, they're things like birth and death, being mothered, being a mother, being fathered, being a father, searching for wisdom, searching for meaning. These are human invariants. And to be fully healthy and whole is to be in relationship with these. And what it does is it gives a context for our personal story. Our personal story is understood in terms of the universal human story. Where do we fit in the human story? And that's really where the domain of myth and religion comes in, because that's what those fields are dealing with, the human story, the place of the human being in the cosmos.
Mm-hmm. And it makes sense then that he would, well, and also as the son of a Protestant minister, he
Right.
would view religion, although he had his wrestling match with it, he would view some potential resources for human development and growth in that area.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's an important function and a natural function of the psyche for Jung. The psyche naturally speaks in religious symbolism and imagery. So it's a part of who we are as far as he's concerned.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about religion. And I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but you use the word religio.
Yes.
And so as I'm reading your book, I'm realizing that you've got a different definition than what might be broadly understood in society. When people say religion, they are often thinking of institutional church, synagogue, so forth and so on. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by this word religio?
Yeah. I think I pronounce it religio, but I'm really not sure if that's the right pronunciation.
We'll play guessing games together.
Sure. Yeah, so this is partly why I call the book Religious but Not Religious, because it's trying to look at that whole realm through a different lens, certainly from the way it's popularly understood, conventionally understood. So religion for Jung, as I said, it's a natural function of the psyche. And one of the things that he does is he makes a distinction between religion and what he calls a creed. So the creed, the confession, is the institutional religion. It's the system of beliefs that we mostly think of as religion. And the problem that he sees with the creed is that it has a tendency over time to get kind of hardened and fixed, and a kind of petrification takes place where it may no longer act as a kind of something that's transparent to transcendence, to the what he calls the original religious experience. And it's that experience, which he also calls the numinous, which he gives the name religion. Religion is the experience of the numinous. It's what he calls, his definition of religion is a dependence on and submission to the irrational facts of experience. And the irrational facts of experience are really just those that cannot be named. They can't be related in a rational way. They are unnameable, ineffable, transcendent. And it's about, as he says, dependence and submission, but he also calls it a careful observation and consideration of the numinous. So it's really an attention, a way of focusing one's consciousness. It's an attitude more than it is a body of beliefs. And when I was working with this idea of the religious attitude over a kind of idea of religion as a thing, my own sense of it started to be that religion it's a work that should be bringing us more in contact with the experience of life, should be exposing us in a sense to the experience of life, overcoming our alienation, the way consciousness kind of can step back from life and observe it. Religion, as I understand it, and as I write about it, is a participation. It's an engagement of the person in that experience, and a kind of greater communion with the experience of life.
And this is, there's a couple things here that I just spend a little time with, because I think one of the things that I certainly have experienced as I've talked in churches is when I invite people and give them permission, and oftentimes that's by telling a particular story of something that I've experienced that is unexplainable, but I attempt to explain it. The pattern I've seen is it's not unusual for somebody, one or two people, to come up to me afterwards and say a version of, "Thank you, I thought I was the only one." And so we have that on the one hand, which I sense as a real desire of people to understand and explore whatever that experience was. At the same time, we have a post-Enlightenment technological, information, data-driven society that is rooted in this observable, this, we detach to look at something, to analyze it. So we're more especially North America in the 21st century, we're more oriented towards like detaching and analyzing something. And yet people still have these experiences where they really enter into this religious experience.
Right. And that what you describe about people saying, well, I thought I was the only one, we don't have trust that we can communicate these experiences because they're they're kind of set apart from how we understand life to work. And so we have doubt about them. Are we allowed to have these experiences? Are they real? What would it mean to share that with other people?
Yeah. And Jung really believed that what ails us most in modern society is this lack of meaning, which is all tied to that. There's this quote that you have in the book. It's originally from Jung. You also cited it in a podcast where Jung says, among all my patients in the second half of life, he defines as over 35, there has not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook on life. It is safe to say that every one of them fell ill because he or she had lost what the living religions of every age have given to their followers, and none of them has been really healed who did not regain his religious outlook. I think of that, and also the story of his meeting with, or maybe in vague involvement with Alcoholics Anonymous, where basically he said to somebody who came to him with an alcohol addiction, he says, until you find the spiritual life that is underneath the spirits that you're drinking, you won't find me. It's really all comes together for Jung. This, modern society is broken because we've lost the ways of meaning, finding it, pursuing it.
Right. We've lost the way of finding meaning. We've lost the way of participating in life. Where do we engage it? He says, well, only in the ritual of life. And we've lost the rituals around the larger kind of cycles of life. We've reduced them to things like graduations and weddings, and those are all important things. But this is the experience of the personal life being related to that larger experience of life, that larger sweep, the story of being human.
Yeah. And religion can be a helpful vehicle. I think obviously we both know, and many people listening to this podcast know, that religion is in no way perfect, and certainly has history of being problematic for people in a number of different ways. But you and I have a similar life experience in that we both grew up with little or no formal religious participation, and yet as adults we've chosen this to participate into that. And most of the people that listen to this podcast are in a church community, a faith community of some kind. So why is church/religion a meaningful experience for you now as an adult?
I really tried to have the meaningful religious outlook on my own. I really tried to do it by myself.
I can relate.
Worked so hard, and yet nothing can really make up for a tradition that has kind of 2,000 years of practice behind it, and tradition. And it's not that things stay the same and are rigid, but but there is a wisdom there, again, not necessarily named, um, but in the full sweep of the structure. So church for me gave me a more comprehensive experience of the spirit than I could generate on my own. Right? So one way is that I can know the stories of my tradition. I can read through the Bible, but in going regularly to church and going through the liturgical calendar every year, the depth of relationship grows. I understand it deeper. I understand it more on a visceral level. It gets out of the head and it comes into the body just by my being in that community, in that space during that time. When you hear the whole congregation saying the Lord's Prayer over and over and over again every week, it's in you. You don't have to think it anymore. And those kinds of experiences are invaluable. And the other piece that I find very meaningful for me, being an introvert, being someone who tried to do it on his own, being someone who was resistant to joining groups, it breaks through that isolation and it breaks through a certain kind of self-enclosed bubble. And I discover that the movement of the spirit can happen in really unexpected places. And in a sense, that's how I see the experience of church. It's, one writer talked about it as, the spirit blows where it will. But if you're not prepared to receive it, it will go right past you and you'll miss it. And the ritual of church and being involved in that community is to be prepared for when it visits. And it visits, could be from the sermon, it could be from the choir singing, it could be from the experience of the Lord's Prayer, or it could be from someone getting up and doing an announcement about the potluck dinner, and they do it in such a way that you're touched and it's unexpected. That you can't generate on your own. You can't kind of make that happen. You have to be there for that visitation. And in a sense, my experience of it is that when I can't do it on my own, when I'm not feeling inspired, when I'm not even feeling like I want to be there, that I don't feel very generous in spirit, I don't feel like I have much of my own to offer, it's a place that carries me, right? It does the work when I can't. It holds the space when I can't do that. And hopefully I can participate in holding that space when others can't do it. So that is beyond valuable. It's not just happening in me. It's something that's happening out in the world.
And so as I listen to you talk, you're really talking about the practices of participation in religion and less concerned with simply agreeing to a set of intellectual beliefs or doctrines. It's the practice of participating that is what gives container, creates opportunity for something to touch you.
Yeah, definitely.
So towards the end of the book, the last section is called How to Cultivate a Symbolic Life. And you have these 5 aspects. We don't need to go over all 5 of them, but maybe you could just touch on these ways in which which I think we've already started with what you were talking about, participation in a faith community, but a couple others, maybe one or two others that are ways in which we can be ready to participate more fully in the symbolic life.
Yeah. Well, the 5 areas, sort of elements of religion, of the institution that I identify in the book are, there's a structure of some kind, organizing structure. There are techniques that guide the individual. There are the images and the symbols, the stories of the tradition. There's the space, and then there's the community. So those are the 5 elements. And I try to understand them in a sense symbolically. What do they serve? What do they point to? Rather than just being these concrete things, what's their purpose? What's their value? And to a certain extent, they all have a different way of bringing the individual's psychology into some alignment and readiness for the spirit that we were talking about before. So we talked about, the liturgical calendar, this sort of organization of the seasons of the year, based more on a natural rhythm as opposed to a chronological sense of time, right? The liturgical calendar, at least as I understand it, kind of has the whole sweep of human life over the year, and we participate in that. Birth, death, resurrection, and this sort of in-between time, what the Catholics call ordinary time, where nothing much happens, or it's just kind of, you're just holding on, or it's not a heightened state. And so to be able to relate to that, not just as a default, but to consciously relate, and this goes actually back to that word religio. Jung identifies 2 meanings of that word. One is the religio links us to something. It links us to the depths. It links us to the divine. But the other meaning of religio is that it's about thinking over again and recollecting, and considering. And that's the definition that he prefers. And what that is it's about the individual's engagement, their work, their participation. We live in this culture where we're passive consumers. And it's a very different experience. You have to participate. You have to be present. The experience of the depths, Jung will say, is a gift of grace, and yet we still have to do the work. We can't produce it, and yet we still have to show up and put the effort in and be ready for that experience of grace that is beyond our ability to generate and produce. And all the other kind of elements participate in that. They set us aside, the space sets us aside from ordinary life and every day. And these days, I was thinking about this, these days, when I go to church, I do it on Zoom, right? So I'm not in the sanctuary. Most of us are not in a sanctuary at the moment. And yet that's still the space. It's created somehow. And the minister at the church that I go to, the Congregational Church, still ends the service by saying, now let us leave this sacred space. Invites us in. So the space is an image for a psychological space that we're entering in, a spiritual kind of state of consciousness. And I think, the other piece, and I touched on this earlier, that I think is really important, is this idea of community. This idea of that the religion, the institution is a community. It's a group of people. It's not just an individual on their own. It's this community. And there's a lot in there about this space between the individual and the collective, the individual and the other, the private and the public. But the other piece that strikes me about that is that it's an image of and a reflection of our interdependence. Right? We can't do everything on our own. We can't carry the whole thing on our own. We need others. And so all of these elements have that meaning, have that purpose of bringing us into awareness of that. And frankly, they're, in my work as an analyst, as a Jungian analyst, all 5 of them are present. There's a structure, there's weekly meetings, there's the techniques that we use. There's a community. There's 2 of us together working on material. So all of those different elements they're not just part of the church, but they are essential to the work of that church and any kind of work.
I think that what you touched on there in the middle of that about worship via Zoom, which you participate in, still has the capacity, because a lot of us think, well, it's in the space, it's in the sanctuary. But what you were saying is, yes, that's true, but what also can be true is by simply the acknowledgement that we are entering in sacred space, and time has a similar kind of impact on people. So therefore, in this COVID time that we're in, when many of us are worshiping through Zoom or other means, it still is serving the same function.
It is, and it may take more intention on our part to enter that space. If we're doing dishes while we're listening, we're not participating in that same way.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and also thank you for the reminder too that religion is a discipline and it requires our participation. And I like the way you put grace and discipline together and you hold them in tension with one another, which is, I think, appropriate and healthy. Yeah. Great conversation. Really wonderful book. I mean, Jung, his writing is dense and difficult for even people that have tried for a long time. And I think your book really helps bring a lot of his insights into language that more people can understand. We've covered a lot. Kind of thinking we're at the end of our time. Anything else you want to add that we've missed or that we should emphasize?
I don't know. We have covered so much, and we can kind of keep unpacking and unpacking. I appreciate what you say about the book, in that it makes that more accessible. That's really the goal of that. My hope is that there are ways to have these conversations across disciplines to begin. One of the things that Jung talks about is that he says we use psychology in order that we're able to talk about life at all. Psychology is not about psychology, it's about life. I think the domain of religion is the same. It's about life. And that's really the meeting ground. how do we enter into this, and how do we enter into dialogues with ourselves, with each other, with the universe that we find ourselves in. That's really what it's the core of this.
Nice, nicely put. Well, thanks for being a part of this. I think people will benefit it. The book is Religious but Not Religious by Jason E. Smith. It's published by Chiron. You can find it there or on Amazon and other fine places where you can get a book, most likely online these days. And if people wanted to connect with you for more conversation, is your website the best way for them to do that?
The website is probably the best way, jungiantherapist.net. I can be found on Twitter, I can be found on Facebook, but it's probably easier to find me there through the website.
Right, good. All right. Well, thanks very much for being a part of this today. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is fun to have these conversations. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.